Hey there! Subscribe to my channel and also press this bell icon so you can get latest video notifications. And this is absolutely free.
You will hear a tour guide talking to a group of tourists who are visiting a cave in Vietnam.
First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our visit to one of the most famous caves in Vietnam. As you know, this cave is famous for its wildlife, and one of the creatures you will observe in here is the small cave cockroach. They live mostly on the bird and bat droppings that are so plentiful in the caves. The guardrails along the trails are covered with these droppings, and this makes a feast for the cockroaches, so be careful where you put your hands. They will not harm you, but it can be a shock if you touch them. Once you're in one of the main caves, look out for the green centipedes. They will not be on the trail, but can often be seen on the wall close by. They feed on other insects and are fascinating to look at because of their colour and, of course, their many legs. Please do not try to pick one up, though. These centipedes have a very nasty poisonous bite. There are also deep red millipedes. These have a fully rounded shape, and they look like a streamlined elongated train with 100 or so closely packed legs extending right and left. When you get to the large high caves, you should look right up above you for the swifts and bats. The bats in this cave are mostly a type of dwarf bat, which are common in this part of the world. They will be clustered high up against the walls, maybe 100 or 200 together. They look like shadows high on the walls of the cave. They are likely to be very quiet right now, but because there are so many of them together, you will have no difficulty identifying them. They sleep all day until they all leave the cave in a massive flock on their nightly hunt for flying insects. The swifts are the creatures you can see flying around during the day, especially if they have young ones to feed. They can navigate in the darkness here and will fly outside in ones and twos at dusk to catch small winged insects like mosquitoes. However, they tend to return before it's pitch black outside, and they do not hunt at night. The swifts make nests, usually higher up on the ceiling of the cave.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
The paths tend to run around the edges of the large caves. Mostly this is because the centre is a mound of guano, the bird and bat droppings. This is also the source of the strong smell inside the caves. You may not like this smell, but the locals know its economic value. They have harvested the products of these caves for centuries. The guano is very valuable as fertilizer, and so it's collected each year, once the young birds have grown and the swifts have abandoned their nests. The guano is not the only valuable byproduct of the wildlife here. As you travel through the caves, you will notice some bamboo structures. These very flimsy-looking sets of poles that go a full 100 metres right up to the roof are what the locals climb up to gather the swifts' nests. These are even more valuable than the guano, as they are the main ingredient in bird's nest soup. Before you begin, it's time for some safety instructions. As you probably know, this is a huge limestone cave that goes about 1 kilometre back into the hills and in places it's 100 metres in height and 300 metres wide. There's no need to crawl around in here as you do in other caves, but it's dark inside, of course. That's why I insisted you bring a working light. Please check that it shines brightly, and ensure that you stay together with others who have a good torch. In one of the larger areas of the cave, the roof is pierced, so some sunlight will get through. It is best to turn your torches off if you can see well and save your batteries. It's a good idea to put your waterproof jacket on now. The walls may be wet, but that's not the main reason for the jacket. The bats and birds do excrete, and they're above you, so just in case. And of course, your hat or hood also keeps you safe from animal droppings. It's not advisable to use the guardrails as handholds. There are lots of droppings on those rails, and don't forget the cockroaches. You absolutely must follow the marked trails. The guardrails on either side are put there so that you cannot mistake them. We take no responsibility for your safety if you go over or under the rails into other cave areas. Keep your torches shining on the path whenever you are moving, just to be sure of your footing, and don't try to go too fast. You might trip, and you will certainly miss some of the fascinating wildlife in the cave. Now, it's time to begin the tour.
That is the end of part 1. Now turns to part 2.
You will hear a reporter talking on the radio about old racing cars. First, look at questions 11 to 16. As you listen to the first part of the talk, answer questions 11 to 16.
The Goodwood Museum is currently celebrating some of the most extravagant types of car design in its Festival of Speed. Here's our reporter, Vincent Freed, who's on site to tell us about some of the cars on display.
Well, here I am, standing in front of one of the most prestigious cars ever built, the Duesenberg. A fantastically expensive, luxurious car built in the early part of the 20th century and bearing all the glamorous qualities of the Jazz Age. How many were there? Well, only 473 Duesenberg J-types were ever built, and the model here is one of the rarest. Each had a short 125-inch chassis or framework, and the body was always in the form of an open two-seater. The technology behind the car's 6.9-litre engine was extraordinary. It featured capsules of mercury in the engines to absorb vibration and provide an incredibly smooth ride. In fact, these cars offered unparalleled performance. In an age when 160 kilometers per hour was considered very fast, the Duesenberg promised a top speed of 180 kilometers per hour. And could do 140 kilometers per hour in second gear. Duesenberg, who designed the car, sold it as a frame and engine. This was typical of the age again, and many prestige manufacturers such as Rolls-Royce did exactly the same. Owners able to afford the hefty $9,000 price tag for the basic car would then commission a coachwork company to build a body tailored to their own individual requirements. The Duesenberg's great attraction for the driver was its instrument panel. which offered all the usual features, but also several others, including a stopwatch. It was the Duesenberg's technology that lay behind its success as a racing car, and they dominated the American racing scene in the 1920s, winning the Indianapolis Grand Prix in 1924, 25, and 27.
Now look at questions 17 to 20. As the talk continues, answer questions 17 to 20.
On to another celebrity, the 1922 Leia Helica. Only 30 of these French propeller cars were built, and the model here at Goodwood, which was the fourth to be made, is thought to be the only surviving example still capable of running. The brains behind this car was Marcel Leia, who was an aviation pioneer first and foremost, and the influence of flying is quite apparent in the car. The Leia very strongly resembles a light aircraft with its front propeller, but in this case, it's minus any wings, of course. It's quite odd to think that this car was whirring through France just as the Duesenberg was blasting down roads at 160 kilometers per hour across the Atlantic. The Leias were used regularly in France in the 1920s, and were even produced in saloon and van form, as well as two-seater. The Leia matched its propeller drive with its equally bizarre steering, which used the rear rather than the front wheels. But despite looking rather frail, it was a tough machine. In fact, when troops tried to steal it during the Second World War, the car's baffling design was clearly beyond the would-be thieves, and it ended up being driven into a tree, breaking the propeller. And now for the Firebird. This extraordinary car was first...
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
You'll hear a tutor and some students discussing eating disorders. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 23. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 23.
Good afternoon. I hope everything is going well. Right, we've been looking at problems some people have with eating. And today I'd like to focus on one you've probably come across in your reading. It is sometimes called binge eating disorder, or BED. As you know, I am not a particular fan of these acronyms, so I will refer to it by the alternative name, compulsive eating disorder. Has anybody heard of it?
Yes, I have. In fact, I read a case study of a first-year university student who was diagnosed with it.
Do you remember what the symptoms are?
Well, of course, one symptom is that the person eats too much, although that's true for other eating disorders as well. They also put on weight.
That's right. Whereas in some other conditions, such as bulimia, they don't, and can actually lose weight. One thing that compulsive eating disorder and bulimia have in common, though, is that the person with the condition often becomes clinically depressed.
Are you saying that everybody who is overweight is suffering from the disorder?
Not at all. What makes the compulsive eater different is the pattern of the disorder. Initially, as we've said, the compulsive eater starts eating too much. This seems to be because the sufferer finds comfort in food and eating is seen as a way of coping with problems. They don't eat because they feel hungry. Mary, in the case study you read, was there any reference to what triggered the problem?
I seem to recall that the student was suffering from stress because she was revising for exams, and she started eating snacks, junk food, while she was studying. Soon, she was eating snacks all the time, and it just got worse from there.
Yes, that sounds plausible, although compulsive eating often starts a lot earlier than the case you describe.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 24 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 24 to 30.
Anyway, once the condition has been triggered, often by constant snacking as you mentioned, it becomes progressively worse. Over a period of time, the sufferer loses control of their food intake. They become preoccupied with food, and the binge eating increases. Overeating blocks out negative emotions such as loneliness, worries about work, depression, and so on. But it is only a temporary effect. Apart from the physical discomfort that overeating often causes, the sufferer begins to feel embarrassed by their behavior. They then take drastic action to try to compensate. In an attempt to lose weight, compulsive eaters will try extreme diets, skipping meals, or going without any food at all for a day or more.
Not a healthy way to try to lose weight, obviously.
Absolutely. And of course, the person has to start eating again at some point.
In other words, it becomes a vicious circle?
That's right. Binge eating, extreme dieting, or attempts to lose weight by other means, and then binge eating again.
What are the long-term effects of compulsive eating?
As you might expect, these are similar to those for people suffering from obesity. Diabetes is frequently reported.
What about treatment?
The disorder can be treated, certainly. But there's always the possibility that the patient will suffer a relapse and start binging again.
What does treatment involve? Medication?
No. It normally involves sessions with a therapist experienced in treating eating disorders. A nutritionist will often be involved as well.
Are there any self-help organizations? I mean, organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous?
Yes, there are. And you might want to follow this one up for your research. One organization is called Overeaters Anonymous, and they have what they describe as a 12-step program to help people overcome the disorder. You can find out more from the organization's website. Right. I think that'll have given you plenty to follow up. So I'll see you at the same time next week.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
You'll hear a lecturer talking about the reintroduction of grey wolves into the wild. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
I am going to talk about one of my favorite animals today, the grey wolf. Similar to other top-level predators, like the shark, wolves sometimes have a bad reputation. It is true, they do sometimes attack herds of livestock that people depend on. In nature, however, grey wolves are a critical part of the ecosystem. Wolves are larger than the average dog. They also have a keener sense of smell since they are not a domesticated species and still live and hunt in the wild. They hunt in small packs and actually have a sophisticated social system. Scientists have observed that wolf packs are well defined by hierarchies. There is one hierarchy for male wolves and one for female wolves. At the top of each is an alpha male and an alpha female. They are not leaders of the pack according to the human definition, but they seem to have special privileges compared to the other wolves. This privilege has to do more with reproducing rather than having more food. Any pair of wolves in a pack may breed, but it is usually the alpha pair's wolf pups that are the most successful. Other pairs may not be able to raise their offspring to maturity, especially when there are limited resources. The alpha status among wolves is not permanent. Wolves are free to challenge the alpha male. These challenges are not necessarily physical fights, but are mostly ritual confrontations that involve bluffing and posturing. There is always the potential for violence, though, and sometimes the jockeying for the alpha status is fatal for one of the participants. The range of the grey wolf and its subspecies used to be quite extensive, almost the entire continents of Asia and North America, and the whole of Europe as well. They are now found mostly in Canada, Alaska, the northern reaches of Eurasia, and a few other scattered pockets. In some parts of the world, grey wolves have actually been reintroduced into the wild. Many people were opposed to these programs at first because they thought it would cause economic hardship for livestock owners. In the United States, local ranchers around the Yellowstone National Park area refused to allow any wolves back. Supporters of the program knew that without cooperation from ranchers, the wolves would likely be shot and killed. Those supporters knew how important the program was and agreed to compensate ranchers for livestock lost to wolves. This important compromise paved the way for the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone in 1995, where they hadn't been seen for over 70 years. The reintroduction has been a great success. Studies show that the biodiversity within the park has increased and is sustaining itself. After the last grey wolves in the park were killed in 1926, the population of elk and deer soared, decreasing the number of plants available to beaver and moose. The beaver eventually became extinct there. The population of other predator species, like the coyote, exploded. This, in turn, caused rodent populations to crash. This crash led to a decline in bird species like hawks and eagles. These negative trends have all reversed since the wolves came back. As a result, Yellowstone National Park is a better, healthier place. The local economy also benefits because people are not only interested in seeing more biodiversity at the park, but also the wolves themselves. This brings in tens of millions of more dollars annually to local lodgings, restaurants, and stores.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.